Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Project Data Analytics community. We are live tonight from Gran Canaria, of all places. So I'm trying a bit of this digital nomad stuff. So yeah, welcome everybody. So we've got a big event tonight. So we've got Dave Snowden tonight. So Dave is a big hero of mine, actually. He's really influenced a lot of my thinking. He's a really good guy, brain the size of a planet. And I think he's really been pushing the boundaries about complexity and complex project management. So a big thanks to Dave for joining us tonight. We did have sort of hundreds of people turning up for tonight, but it's a sunny day there in the UK, so presume that some people has gone out for a pina colada instead. So yes, so I'll get going. So welcome everybody. My name is Martin. I'm the founder of the Project Data Analytics community, set it up in 2017 to try and champion this vision about project data analytics. So let me try and explain what it's all about. And before I start that, so just to point out to you, if you're showing your camera or anything like that, this is going to be video tonight. So it's going to be on the YouTube channel in the next 48 hours or so. So if you don't want to be videoed, you don't want to be recorded or anything, then please turn your camera off. If you could go to Mentimeter, so if you could look at Menti for me, I'd be very grateful indeed. Somebody's microphone, if you could just turn that off for me, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. If you go on mute, if one of my team could mute them, please, I'll be very grateful. So if you go to Mentimeter, can you see that okay? Is that working, Yoshi?
No, we can't see your screen yet, Martin.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Let me fix that. Sorry, folks, just bear with me. I thought I was sharing my screen. There we go. So there's the Mentimeter code. So there's menti.com. It's 42396273. So we just want to know where people are dialing in from tonight. That'd be really great. Thank you. Got Dave here. Welcome, Dave. We'll be with you in a minute, Dave. We're just going through a bit of a Menti survey. So what we're trying to do, basically, everybody, is to write some reports. So we put the first one out recently, and that report was about some of the barriers to project data analytics and what people are thinking about it, etc. So those reports come from these Mentimeter surveys. So if you help us with them, and we feed it back to you in reports, you can take that to your boss and use that to try and get some momentum going. There's only 31 people on Mentimeter, so if you could all try and dial in for me, I'd be very grateful. 42396273. So let me go to the next question on Mentimeter. So which sector do you typically work in? And we use this to try and segment as well as part of these reports. So if you could share some of that with us, we'd be grateful. So a lot of people from construction. So that's been our base. That's where we started from. Now I think it's starting to expand. So we've got some people here from the NHS as well. So that's good. Some people from retail. That's new. We don't have many people from retail normally, so that's good. Let's just keep these numbers notching up. I'd be grateful indeed. Right. So is this your first time for a PDA meetup, or you're a veteran? So we've got a few newbies in there. And 19% of people are veterans. So Dave, you're attracting a new crowd tonight as well. That's good. 36%, 33% of people are brand new. And the other 2/3 have sort of been at least once before. So thank you. And which sector are you from? Public, private, academia, or the third sector? So a lot of people from the private sector. This does frustrate me a little bit about the public sector, because we've got so much to learn on this stuff. And I like to get the word out there, but it's not quite sticking. So if anybody's got any thoughts about making this stick a little bit better with the public sector, I'll be very grateful. And what topics would you like Dave to cover tonight? All right, so if there's anything in particular that you'd like Dave to weave into his presentation, and please let us know. Yoshi, could you just make sure you're covering the door for me as well and letting everybody in? Is that all right? So any topics? PMO and data. So yeah, I think some of these might be difficult for Dave to weave in, but we'll have a go. Project complexity and impacting outcomes, a disaster response. So I know you've done some stuff on that in community resilience. Risk management. So you'll have some views on risk management. You know, I think that we need to go and totally reinvent risk management. So I'll have a conversation about that, Dave. Project complexity, major projects delivery, carbon data, black swans and black swan indicators. Dependency management, major projects delivery. So data analysis of past data can help with complex systems involving emergence and high uncertainty, risk mitigation, record keeping for avoiding disputes. I'm not quite sure that's your bag, but we can have a go if you want. Stopping risky projects. So, can we do some of that as well? So plenty there for you, Dave. If you want me to stop on that, just let me know. Have you got that, Dave? Is that all right? All good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. Thanking you. Right. Let me just go back again. So, in terms of what we're trying to do with the community, we're trying to sort of join together this expertise from project portfolio and program management with data analysis and data science and artificial intelligence. And that's the sweet spot there in the middle, which is project data analytics. And what we're starting to do, we are getting a lot of traction with this now. It is starting to move. It's been a difficult sort of 3 years or so, 4 years, but it's now starting to move. So what we're trying to do is to exploit these rich seams of project data, of which there are vast amounts. We've got to demonstrate the art of the possible. We've got our hackathons to do some of that, and we're working with the community. It's to be the driving force for change as well. And we're doing a lot of that as well. So we run these events every couple of weeks. We've got the task force going. We've got lots of other initiatives. So what we're also trying to do is to grow this new cadre of skilled professionals. It's those people who sit in that sweet spot there in the middle. And those people didn't exist a few years ago. So the brand new people, the pathfinders, they're helping us to transform project delivery. What we're also trying to do is to bring people together. So we've got this collegiate network where we can all help each other. And if you're stuck on something, you can reach out through the community and you can start to get some answers. But what we're also going to do is start to share some solutions. Now, I did promise this by the end of August. It slipped a bit because of some staffing issues, but we should get it live by the end of September. So that will be sort of open sourcing things which have been developed through the community. And finally, right, what's really important to us as well is facilitating startups, right? So if you've got a company and you've got some good ideas and you want to get going, reach out across the community and go and find some kindred spirits there, try and find some funding. There's loads of people who've done it. So Dev's done it. He's got $18 million recently. Nodes and Links have done it with Greg. He's got $11 million recently. So there's quite a few people involved in this community who's got some big chunks of cash, and that's from organizations such as Google Ventures as well. So the upcoming events, in terms of today's event, right, is with Dave. Now, Dave, I've probably known Dave for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. I've been following this stuff for quite a long time. And it's changed my thinking probably more than anybody else has. And I've run some big projects. I've run some billion-dollar jobs, right? So some mega projects. That's the definition of a mega project, is a billion-dollar job. And what we tend to do is try and plan our way out of them, especially infrastructure projects. And I don't think that's right. I don't think it's the right way of doing it. And I think that Dave's got some methods which are absolutely spot on. And I think it's the blend of Dave's thinking with project data analytics, and we've got something really special. So I'm really pleased that Dave's joining us tonight to share some of that thinking, because it is, you know, it's pretty transformational, and I think it's going to change the way we think about projects. So I'm really looking forward to it tonight. So thanks, Dave. The next event is on the 22nd of September with Mark Wilcock. Now, Mark gave me the inspiration to set this thing up. So he runs something called the London Business Analytics Group, which is all about Power BI and Excel and that sort of stuff. So more on a business intelligence side of things. And Mark's been a real sort of champion of driving forward data analytics across every single sector, not just projects. And as well as a Microsoft MVP. So we'll take you through a load of thoughts about analysing and visualising project data. And he's got some great examples. So the next one I've got is with James. So James is running these every 2 months now. And basically it's an introduction to project data analytics. So it tells you about the starter kit, about what Python means, what all these different systems means, and to run you through some examples and really bring it to life. We're running those to try and inspire people, take away some of the fear about what project data analytics is all about. And it's not that scary, actually. You know, once you get into it, you'll start to change the way you work, you start to change the way you think, and you'll move yourself up the value chain as well. It's a much more fulfilling job. What we've also got as well, so I mentioned the task force. So the task force has been going now for about a year. So we've got another follow-up event. So that's on the 23rd of November. So put that in your diary for lunchtime. And it's going to give you an update on all these things we've been doing. So we've got quite a lot of papers coming together and thought pieces, and we're going to get those out. Some surveys coming out as well. So we'll tap into the community and we'll keep you plugged into that. But please reserve that lunchtime date if you can. Just stick it in your diary. In terms of news, the big thing for us is Project Hack 11. So it's our first in-person event for probably 18 months, right? And it is really cool, right? Really, really cool event. So that's the sort of food you're going to get. So there's this lady called Marie. She's a French lady who's going to cook for us. That's the venue. It's not in the Microsoft Reactor this time because it's still closed because of COVID. So we've got the Hallam venue, it's called, and it's the conference centre. So we've got 2 floors in there to make sure you're all appropriately distanced. We have food. We're going to have a breakfast and lunch on both sort of days. Plus, we've got a free bar on the Thursday night. So a big thanks to the sponsors for that. So please get involved and please sign up. If you want some tickets, there's some early bird tickets on sale now. So just tick that. There's a QR code as well. So if you're part of the Project Data Academy, you get a free ticket because it's part of your course. If you want students, then please, if you want student tickets, then please contact Sophie, and Sophie will give you a free ticket. In terms of the profits from that, they all go to cancer research, right? We don't keep any of it. Some of it goes to the Vatman and Eventbrite, but the rest of it goes to cancer research. We've raised thousands of pounds over the years, so it's all down to you guys. So thank you very much indeed. So please support it. Please come along. Please get involved, and we'll move the dial between us. So thank you very much. Next thing is, if there's any sponsors out there who would like to get involved, we do run these things sort of on a shoestring. You know, we try and put a really, really good event on, and it's my company who tends to subsidise them. So if you can get involved and help us out, that'd be great. If you've got some challenges you want solved as well, so it's crowdsourcing solutions to your problems, then please get involved. So I'd just like to go back to Mentimeter very briefly, and then I'll close, and I'll pass over to Dave. So Menti, so a current job role. So what sort of jobs have you got at the moment? Leadership, delivery specialist. So Dave will get a feel for the sort of people out there so we can tailor his talk accordingly. So project controls. And I think it's really important with project controls, Dave. I think that your sort of thinking impacts project controls probably more than anything else. So they spend a lot of time planning, and in a complex environment, they'll just spend all day long planning, and you'll be changing the plan all day long. So what's your advice to people in project controls? I think that's a really good consideration for people. So if you give some advice on that, you've got some people from universities, data professionals, leadership, quite a few from leadership there as well. So where did you find out about this event today? If you just let me know about that, I'd be grateful, and we can use that and feed that back. And what's your professional level? So your entry level, intermediate, mid-level, or senior executive. So what sort of people have we got out there? And that's probably going to influence where Dave's going to be pitching tonight as well a little bit. So we've got a smorgasbord of everybody, mostly mid-level, intermediate, a few at entry level, but not that many. Cool. So welcome to you all. So I've done the presentation bits. So in terms of this community survey, right, I've got some techie questions for you now. And I'm doing these techie questions because this is what we're going to put into the report back to you in Q3 probably. So if you could just answer these questions for me, and if they're not relevant to you, then don't fill it in, but please have a quick look at these. So in terms of visualization dashboards, are you dabbling at the moment? You've got role-based dashboards or not? You've got dynamic dashboards. So basically, where do you feature at the moment? So if you could start to score these for me, I would be grateful. We've got 10 scores, 12 scores on there, so please keep them notching up. So these reports are for your benefit. We publish them so you can benchmark yourself against others and understand where you are and just try and get some views. So the more people engaged in it, the more sort of relevant is the report back to you. So there's a right mixture there. So there's some people who's just dabbling and some people who's probably doing quite a lot on it. You've got role-based dashboards. So only one person's got role-based dashboards and 10 people strongly disagree. And dynamic dashboards, there's a few, but not many. So that's interesting. So we can feed that back to Mark Wilcock as well in his sort of upcoming talks as well. So in terms of visualizations, we use the basics, we integrate our data and use DAX. We've got complex integrated data pipelines. So the majority of people are in the basics. And then about 20% of people have got complex data pipelines, and some people are using DAX. So most of you tend to be in the basics type arena. So tune into Mark's talk and we'll fix that. So that's fascinating, actually. I thought it'd be a lot more than that. So the apprentices out there, you should be more in the DAX space as well. You know, so that's maybe the 14%, 17%, and maybe the apprentices who's got a bit more experience will be up here. So pulling in Python and things. So your organization's use of dashboards as well at the moment, you're just starting, you've just got enough of them, you've got too many of them, etc. So you've got too many dashboards, some people, I think that's where we're all going to get to. It's going to be overwhelming, which is something Dave can play to actually, is that, you know, dashboards are not going to get us out of complexity necessarily. So, and I think we try and measure our way out of it, which is not always the case. So it works in some parts of the project spectrum, but not all. And that's interesting. There's 7 people there who's got dashboards and they don't tend to get used. So that's quite disappointing. It'd be interesting to find out why. So that's maybe something we can drill into a little bit more. So I've almost finished. So a few more questions. So in terms of effective use of dashboards, people don't use them properly or can't read them. And that's not being able to read them because they can't see them. It's more interpreting them. It's the way they have been crafted. It's the stories they're trying to tell. You know, and I see dashboards coming out of hackathons and it's just people taking data and sticking it into charts and not thinking about the story they're trying to tell. So it's about sense making, and Dave's sort of all over sense making, and he'll tell you that in spades. So interesting, there's a third of people out there who's saying that they've got the wrong information to make effective decisions. And only 8% of people been using dashboards to provide useful insight. Now that is a shocking statistic. I didn't realise it was that bad. And 15% of people saying they can't see the wood for the trees. Now that's a fascinating chart. Really, really fascinating. So if I were you, I'd take a screen grab of that and feed that back to some of your peers, because you're probably spending a lot of money on this and it sounds like it's not working, which is borderline criminal, really. So that's it. So if I could end, I'll just get my presentation back up again. I'll drag that out of the way. So if you want to contact me, there's my LinkedIn details. And without any further ado, I'll pass over to Dave. So Dave, a massive thanks for coming tonight. I do appreciate it. This is your second outing to the Project Data Analytics community. The first one was back in the old days when we could actually meet each other in Skills Matter before that went belly up. So there's a lot of things that's moved on since, Dave. So welcome back. So a big round of applause to Dave. So Dave, the floor is yours, sir. So thank you.
Okay, so first of all, there will be no slides, right? Yeah. Slides are a distraction, so I'm going to talk, right? I'll try and keep an eye on the chat room as we go. So if there's something which is confusing you or you've got a question, just dump it in there and I'll try and adjust accordingly, right? I don't intend to speak for the entire allocated time because I really want to allow for an active discussion. So that's the plan, right? And I've got 2.5 hours of this sort of presentation. I've got Jordan Hill for an hour after you, which will be far more esoteric, looking at transhumanism and the survival of the human race. So it's I'm building up to that at the moment. Right? And Martin, thank you for delaying for your introduction, carrying on long enough for me to see the final of the final set of the quarterfinal in the tennis in New York. So that was good news. Right?
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Bernard, could you do me a favour, please? Because we'll be videoing this tonight. Could you turn your camera off, please, Bernard? I'll be very grateful. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm now dealing with a situation where I can't see anybody, so I'm going to talk to the void for a period and then open up. But as I say, feel free to drop stuff in the chat as we go. Just to give you, by way of background, my dominant experience in project management, and I do have a Prince 2 certificate somewhere in the loft, all right, if I need to get it out, is in software development. So I designed, built, wrote, tested, and implemented the decision support systems for people like Guinness PLC and Maersk Shipping and the like, and that was back in the 80s and 90s. I designed and built and project managed a multi-million-dollar project for Channel 4 for their data warehousing for advertising trackage. So that's, you know, and a few defense projects I'm probably still not allowed to talk about. So I've been involved in software for some time. And then when we started to get into the whole issue about narrative forms of knowledge, that started ironically to get me involved in civil engineering. So quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about came actually from a seminal project we did with Lend-Lease in the days when Stuart was CEO, and that was working on understanding knowledge flow and project management in the Blue Water development in Kent, in the San Francisco waterfront development and Darling Harbour, were the 3 big civil engineering projects we worked on. So I've never been, I've done the job, I've been involved in it. We've done work with people like Boeing and the like, but I never really wanted to be a full-time project manager. It's far too much like hard work, to be honest. The other thing is, there are 2 or 3 areas which I'm going to bring into this. One is the recently published European Union Field Guide to Managing in Complexity, Brackets and Chaos, which is actually a field guide to complexity management, a joint publication of my research centre, the Cynefin Centre, and the European Union. Somewhat ironic, given that we're no longer a member, but never mind. Or rather, I do mind, but I've learned to live with it. I'll talk a bit about that because that's actually how you manage when things are going wrong, all right? And that's available free online in virtual form, and the actual physical books came out today. So we're going to be starting to launch some material around that. The other area was a major project, and in 3 days' time we got the anniversary of 9/11. That was a seminal event for me. I was actually in the Pentagon in the part which got hit by the plane the day before. I flew back overnight that night and picked up the news the next day. And we'd been working on a big DARPA project, working directly for Poindexter, who you might remember was Reagans NSA. And that kind of like got really serious. About 4 weeks later, I got flown back into the States on an American transport plane from Singapore. And a large part of what we're looking there is weak signal detection. So how do you spot early things which later on you realize are highly significant, but you don't realize at the time? And that came out of the work I was doing in complexity theory and in what's called organic knowledge management or narrative-based knowledge management. And that was about 15 years of my life, was every 4 weeks for a week in Washington, working on that project. That stuff got picked up by the Singapore government, and I left IBM. It's kind of like the Singapore government gave me an ultimatum. I could leave IBM and they give me a contract to build their risk assessment and horizon scanning system, or I could stay in IBM and wouldn't get the contract. So that gave me the impetus and, to be honest, the cash to set up Cognitive Edge, and everything kind of like went from there. So that's by way of sort of general background. I've done a lot of time on UX design. If you ever fly into Helsinki, I'm partly responsible for the air traffic management system there. And I've always been on the human side, or understanding human issues, directly relating to information flow, to data flow, and everything else. So that's kind of like a general background. In terms of the field that I now work in, which I created, it's a field which is generally titled Naturalizing Sense Making. And sense making comes with a hyphen. It's actually very significant whether you use a hyphen or not, certainly in academic circles. This is now recognized as one of the 5 distinct schools of sense making. So I'll put the academic link on that up so you've got that as well. And I define sense making as how do you make sense of the world so that you can act in it. And with that definition comes a concept of sufficiency. So how do I know the nature of what I know, and how do I know that I know enough to make a decision in context? So that's what I mean. But sense making for me is really focused heavily on decision making in context. Naturalizing, which comes from philosophy, and my background is physics and philosophy in my original degree, it means to root what you think in the natural sciences, so to use the natural science as a constraint. So let me give you a few illustrations from that and then talk about why it's important. So let's start off with the sort of classic example. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, and you make it in plain sight, then on average, 83% of radiologists will not see the picture of the gorilla even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. This is called inattentional blindness. And it's not a phenomenon that you can actually train people not to do. The most we scan of available data before we make a decision is between 3 and 5%. If you're Chinese, that doubles, and that's related to abstraction in language, but leave that for the moment. So for most people from a Western background, you scan 3 or 5% of what's available to you. That then triggers a complex set of memories, some of which can be generated by computers, some of which come from your brain, some from your body, some from your social interactions. And they're quite messy. And what you then do is you blend those fragmented memories together. And the first effectively pattern which comes from those fragments, which actually seems to fit, you apply. So what you do is a first fit pattern match, not the best fit pattern match. We evolved to basically satisfies, not optimize. So we don't look for the optimal solution, we look for the first solution which appears to fit. Now, if you think about why that happened in evolutionary terms, then think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, or possibly the shore of the Mediterranean. That's become an open question at the moment. Something, a predator, a large, yellow thing runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, And having identified lion, look at best practice case studies in how to avoid lions. By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Noah from the Old Testament, which is the only survival memoir I've actually seen of somebody who escaped from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privilege on our most recent experience. And that's simply true. If somebody is deeply autistic, they're less prone to it, but for most people, that's the norm. Now, once you realize that, that acts as a constraint. It means if people are not expecting to see things, they literally won't see them, even though their eyes scan them. If you look at the difference between the first shuttle disaster and the second shuttle disaster, in the first shuttle disaster, they identify retrospectively that people didn't have the right information to make the right decisions, so they build a system for that. Second shuttle disaster, all the right people had the right information, but they didn't pay attention to it. They kind of like got the principle wrong. It also means you can't trust systems analysts. It means you can't trust in project definition phase, you can't trust people finding out what's really needed, because people will tend to go with this first fit pattern match. And that changes the dynamics of the way we do things. It means the role of a systems analyst in software development is deeply dubious. If I look at some of the work we've done on urban redevelopment, we've started to use the whole of the population as a sensor network, rather than allowing a limited number of experts to go and interview people or do analytical work. I'll come back and talk about that later when I talk about a new Gemba initiative, which we're about to launch. So that's an illustration of a key fact from natural science. We do not see what we do not expect to see. We will not see things which later turn out to be highly significant. And then you get linked to that, what's called the problem of retrospective coherence, or the benefit of hindsight, is whenever we look backwards, we can see all the things that we should have seen. And we basically assume that everybody else should have seen them too. And therefore we construct best practice, we construct processes based on what we're seeing with the benefit of hindsight. Now that again is problematic. So if you look at the events building up to 9/11, with the benefit of hindsight, we realized that it was very significant that a whole group of people, were being trained to take off and fly, but not to land. Now, once we understand what happened in 9/11, we can see the significance of that. And it was reported by an FBI agent in advance, but nobody paid attention. Now, again, with hindsight, everybody celebrates that and said we should have listened to that woman. She was brilliant. We'll promote her. We'll give her more status. The reality is, in any major disaster in human systems, somebody is always warned about it in advance. But the sheer volume of warnings is not possible to process using conventional data analytics. One of the best ways I've learned to illustrate this is to think about the British phrase, which says, why didn't we join up the dots? In fact, it's not just British, it's American. If you read the congressional report on 9/11, you'll find its conclusion is we should have joined up the dots. Where if you simply look at the mathematics of dots, if I have 4 dots, so imagine 4 dots on a piece of paper, then there are 6 lines that can be drawn to connect the dots around the square and the 2 diagonals. And that means there are 64 possible patterns. So 4 dots, 64 possible patterns. A pattern be defined as any combination of dots or connection lines. If I go up to 10 dots, and I do this as an exercise with people regularly, ask them to estimate how many patterns they think there are. And it's like the more senior there are, the fewer they think there are. Very few people get anything like near the actual number, which is in excess of 3.6 trillion. If I go up to 12 dots, it's over 4.8 quadrillion. There's an old Chinese story about that called the Emperor's Chessboard, in which a sage, asked by the emperor what rewards he wants for a service, says, I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and double thereafter. And there isn't enough rice in China to satisfy it. So the danger is hindsight is not very good. In fact, hindsight isn't the same thing as foresight. And the danger is we spot what went wrong last time and we assume we've therefore fixed the problem. But actually what will go wrong next time is something completely different. So that's a problem with the dangers of hindsight. Linked with that is a statistical issue in that most people, for example, assess risk based on a normal distribution, a Gaussian distribution. So you see this a lot in hospitals. If I look at the work we've been doing in the NHS, they tend to assume single morbidity when they assess risk. The minute you move into multiple morbidity, you're not in a normal distribution, a Gaussian distribution, you're in a Pareto distribution, which has a really fat tail, which means that things that you can dismiss as highly improbable, yeah, if you assume a normal distribution, actually become quite possible if you assume a Gaussian distribution. And the danger is we develop risk and safety measures based on the assumption of a normal distribution when reality is different. We've done pioneering work in the health service, in police firearms squads, in the fire service, which has actually shown the main reason for mental breakdown is the health and safety regulations, not the job. Because the health and safety regulations have been based on a retrospectively coherent average situation, not on the reality of people's day-to-day lives. So I'm giving you several illustrations here. And that sort of leads into the final one I want to mention today. There's a lot more, which is the science of complex adaptive systems. And this is where the Cynefin framework comes from. And I'm not going to do a Cynefin presentation. There's loads of material available online, and you can look that up and deal with it. But basically, Cynefin is based on complexity theory. And it identifies three primary types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. So ordered systems have a very high level of constraint, which means they have a high level of predictability. So you have a linear relationship between cause and effect. And it may be something fairly simple and clear. So in Britain, we drive on the left. In Germany, they drive on the right. That's the categorization problem. You know what to do. Or it may be quite complicated. It may require expert knowledge or analysis. But the point is there is a right answer. It can be discovered. It can be presented. A chaotic system, in my language, and this isn't, the field is fairly immature, so not everybody uses language the same way. In my way of looking at it, chaos is a system without effective constraints. So it's a disaster. It's a catastrophic change. So it never lasts for long, but it can cause massive disruption. And the upside is you also get massive innovation. But the dominant type of system in humans is a complex adaptive system. And the best description I've ever heard of complexity was from Alicia Gerraro, who said the complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. My hobby is mountain and coastal walking. I've just come back from 30 days in a heat wave on the Southwest Coastal Path. And actually, there's lots of brambles around, so you can eat the blackberries as you go, but you do not want to get stuck in a small woodland with loads of bramble bushes, because everything is connected with everything else. You pull one thing and something hits you in the back. You know that there are separate plants, but you can't separate them. Everything is deeply and thoroughly entangled. And the only thing I understand for certain about a complex adaptive system is that whatever I do will have unintended consequences. The other feature of complexity, which is important for project management, is that in one of the definitions of a complex system is that you have competing hypotheses as to what you should do next, all of which are coherent and supported by evidence, but which contradict each other. And this is a situation frequently faced by C-level executives, and I've been one for a lot of my life, right? You're sat at your desk and about 8 people come in with proposals as to something you should do, which has major financial and reputational impact. And they're all deep experts in their field. They've all researched this. They're all highly knowledgeable. They all present their results. And you're meant to make a decision in 4 or 5 minutes. And that's the reality. Once you understand complexity, you take a very different approach. So any coherent idea gets a small amount of investment, and you run parallel safe to fail probes. They're not experiments, they're probes. So it's rather like in military terms. If you're facing a VUCA environment, a highly uncertain environment, you send out multiple patrols and see who dies. I'm sorry to be brutal, but that's called a safe to fail experiment in military terms. You expect some people to die. So what the probes do is they reveal the nature of the space to you. They're not designed to succeed or fail. They're designed as a revealing of possibilities, or more important, of plausibilities, within the system. So complexity gives us those 3, 4, and then maybe 4 or 5 lenses. So primarily, is it ordered? Is it complex? Is it chaotic? And then you have different methods or tools associated with that. The key thing in a complex world is you need real-time feedback loops from multiple perspectives. So you can't afford to have an expert perspective because that's the radiologist not seeing the gorilla. You have to remember that 17% do see the gorilla, so you need to find a way in which you can get their feedback in real time and actually see the results. And that's actually at the essence of a whole body of work on weak signal detection. So what I've tried to get across in the first part of this, and I've rambled around a bit, is natural science basically creates what's called a counterfactual universe. It means we know that there are things which are not possible. So it's not possible for linear cause and effect to allow prediction in a complex system. It's just a priori not possible. So there's no point in doing prediction. Also, in a complex adaptive system, you can't know the outcome. So there's no point in having KPIs based on outcomes. You'll actually just perverse results. Doesn't mean that you don't have KPIs, but KPIs are vector measures which measure direction and speed of travel for intensity of effort. Because if the system is complex, you start journeys with a sense of direction, but you don't have specific goals. So that changes the way we do the definition stage of a project, for example. And that's key to understand.
Dave, a quick question if I can. In terms of the definition of complex projects, so in places like Highways England, which is now National Highways, there's a sort of department there called complex projects, right? So there's a chap called Alan Perkins there, who's the head of complex projects. What's your view on the definition of a complex project? Is it such a thing, or is a project sort of coming and going through each of your different?
A project has complex and ordered aspects. When most people in project management talk about complex projects, they talk about the number of things they have to deal with, and they see it as directly proportional to that. That's not a complex adaptive system. So probably the key thing to understand is an ordered system is contained, a complex adaptive system is connected. So you can't know the boundary space. And the trouble is an awful lot of approaches to project management have come from systems thinking. And systems thinking defines a system as something which has a boundary. Whereas complexity is fundamentally saying actually human systems don't have boundaries. That's the wrong way of framing the problem. So I'm talking about complex adaptive systems. So if I've got a project isn't complex, a project is. The key thing is to work out what elements of it are ordered, what elements of it are complex, and the degree of complexity. And then there's this fifth domain in Kinevium, which is quite important, which is called Aperia. Sorry, I'm allowed a couple of words, all right? Aperia is a Derrida concept. What Derrida says is a question to which you know an answer isn't a question, it's a process. So the only useful question is one to which you don't know the answer, but you've got to think differently about the problem. So that's called Aperia. So if you look in the EU field guide, it identifies the way that you manage a crisis is you immediately introduce massive draconian constraints. The New Zealand Prime Minister did this brilliantly. She actually broke the law to impose lockdown in COVID, but that increased the number of options she had available. So decision making in a crisis is always about imposing constraints to give options. It's not about coming up with a solution, right? That's the key thing. In fact, the key thing to understand as a senior leader is you actually should distribute decision making and centralized coordination, except where you need to do that drastic intervention. So once you've done that, if you can actually create options, you move into the apparetic space. And I'm now going to go on and talk about several of the methods and tools we're developing, and then kind of like finish up and open up for questions. Right? So some of the things you then do is, you work out what in the project is something which experts should decide. You then frequently have an issue where you have competing experts. So, for example, in COVID, we had massive competition between behavioral economists and epidemiologists. Now, as a decision maker, as a politician, it's very difficult when you have 4 or 5 different sets of competing experts. So one of the methods we developed for that, which is in the UField guide and in the open source wiki, so if anybody wants to get into this stuff in more detail, we actually have an open source wiki which anybody can participate in. We developed a method called the Triopticon, which is a highly sophisticated, highly structured competition between experts and sub-experts, which takes place over a day or 2 days, which is designed for transdisciplinary understanding and to support decision making, i.e. which experts should you trust where. We then have this whole concept, if the problem is complex, how do you construct probes in order to test what's possible? In software, you do that with things like RAD techniques and JAD techniques and fast prototyping before you commit to a design. And there are equivalents that you can actually do, for example, in NHS planning. We've done a whole body of work on that in Wales and elsewhere. There are also fascinating things that you can start to do in terms of using simulation games. So we actually have simulation games in which multiple competing teams work in parallel, and whatever they do, they're doomed to fail. I watched too much Star Trek when I was young. That we originally pioneered for military decision making with the Marines and in also Singapore. But we now use that in project management. So we literally create games, often in science fiction environments, which are built on the actual project. So we want people to be distanced. And we take teams in parallel through multiple stages. So you present a situation, everybody comes up with what they would do. While they come up with what they do, you feed them data continuously to disrupt them. You then call a halt, and whatever they came up with turns out to be a disaster. It's fairly easy to take something they missed and project it forward. Repeat 3 times. At the end of that, people, and we measured this, people generally scan 20 to 30 times more data before they make a decision than if they actually succeed. Another little bit of science is that the brain pays more attention to failure than it does to success, and we learn more from failure than from success. So actually worst practice systems are a more valuable form of knowledge repository than best practice systems, and people learn from them. Yeah, I can give you some more examples of that you want later. So that concept of basically allowing that sort of flexibility, those probes to see what's possible, to run games in which you can actually work out what will or wouldn't work, yeah? And the metaphor-based games are important, are all techniques to create a sort of continuous lessons learned. The other thing, and this is where we originally worked with the US government, and we did extensive work here on weak signal detection in civilian populations. So when you're looking at terrorism, what you're interested in is the underlying dispositional state. So if you go back to Northern Ireland in the 1970s, and I was involved then as a young trainee Jesuit in peace and reconciliation, and I still remember one night I was in the Falls Road and I got picked up by the police, an RUC Land Rover, and asked which of my legs did I want shot first. Yeah, and this was the police. Yeah? And then they heard my accent and realized I was from mainland. I wasn't, as they called me, a filthy tay. And they threw me out of the Land Rover. Now, to be quite honest, if the IRA Provo commander had come around that night, I might well have joined. But the level of injustice in the system reached a tipping point, to use Malcolm Gladwell's term, and then Bloody Sunday triggered that tipping point, and after that, it took us 20 years to recover. So what we focused on, and we did this work in Colombia, we're actually doing work on peace and reconciliation in the States at the moment, post-election, based on these principles, is we started to focus on micro-narrative capture distributed in the population itself in order to sense or see the underlying patterns of street stories, in order to mathematically measure when the dispositional state was such that a very small event would trigger a catastrophic shift. And one of our pioneering projects on that was when we used children as ethnographers in Egypt. And I still remember Tony and I writing the report and saying, this looks like it's stable, but if you look at the mathematics of the data we've captured, there's multiple self-cancelling instabilities. So one small event could trigger a massive catastrophic phase shift. And then I think a month later, the guy burnt himself alive. We got the Arab Spring. So a big area of what we focused on is not trying to predict negative outcomes, but predicting when a negative outcome is more plausible. So you can't predict a terrorist outrage, but you can say when a terrorist outrage is more plausible so that human beings pay more attention to data. Now, where we're going with this on project management, and we'll be launching this in a few weeks' time, is to create a Gemba system using that Japanese concept, yeah, of sort of workflow observation, in which everybody involved in a project can do continuous micro observations of anomalies, defects, things that they're concerned about, things that they've done. Generally, when we put that in place, we say you don't have to write reports anymore. We famously did this with the US Army in Afghanistan, where we said you don't have to write a patrol report if you keep your field observations up to date in the Gemba system. That gave us real-time data for multiple human observers, which we could be combined with machine data. And that gave us a huge improvement in IED detection, or what's known as the three-legged goat problem. So that's black military humor. So the same sort of principle applies in projects. Yeah, so what we're working on, and we are about to start a project to create a complexity-based extension to Prince 2. I've given up trying to work with the PMI because they've gone down a particularly shallow path of late, so we have to wait for them to come out of that. But we're planning at the moment is to work with the Prince 2 guys to produce a complexity extension. And part of that is continuous real-time data capture, critically with human interpretation of the data. We're not just doing black box AI here. Human interpretation of data using abstractions, using symbols, using pictures, gives us much better data. And that data can be used to trigger what are called anticipatory alerts, i.e. to bring the attention of senior manager to the plausibility that a project may be about to go off track. And the other big area we're working in is the architecture of projects. So in software, it's more important to have objects interacting around and within scaffolding and allow the application to emerge from that interaction than to define the interaction up front. Yeah. So let me give you a real example of that. And this is still a personal scar. Right? So you may remember there was a big thing in the NHS called the patient record system, which was a Tony Blair project designed to solve all problems. I've subsequently learned from the Cabinet Office that people tried to dissuade him, but it was kind of like a big project and politicians love that. It's now got a lot worse than Tony Blair. So either way, IBM, and I was still working for IBM, wanted to bid for it. I got put on the bid team. After 2 meetings, I got thrown off the bid team because I basically said we should no bid it. It was kind of like doomed to fail. You could tell that by the guy who was in charge of it, because he used to work for ICL and was famous for thinking that human beings were limited capacity information processing devices. And they had all sorts of assumptions like common equipment for everybody and, you know, the whole bunch of stuff. I mean, anybody with any experience in IT could say this was going to be a disaster. And of course it was. IBM did bid, they lost the bid, they were grateful subsequently they didn't. And the problem was it was designed as an ordered system. So the idea is one centralized database with security, all the data is in the right place at the right time. I mean, anybody in Britain will remember all the stories on this. And it was kind of like a context-free solution in a context-specific world. So to be quite honest, for people within 2 or 3 years of likely death, there was no need to take the old Bevan cards and computerize them. In fact, by the way, if you don't know it, there's a lot of evidence that handwritten notes by doctors contain better information than typed notes on a computer screen, and that doctors pay more attention to patients if they're writing notes than if they're typing into a computer. So there are some wider issues on that. Either way, it was fairly obviously going to go wrong. We designed an alternative system which actually got picked up in Australia and Japan. And this is a complexity-based design. So we basically said, okay, everybody should carry their records with them. It's either, you know, the old Bevan cards in those little brown boxes, or it's an implanted chip which can be scanned, or it's a credit card. And all we need to do is invest in common scanner technology between doctors' surgeries, hospital surgeries, machines. So if a patient comes in, you just scan their wrist if they got an implanted chip. Yeah. That gives you the last recorded medical data. You update as you go. And if anybody loses something then you can always go back to the last contact. Now that's a distributed design. You're focusing on objects and interactions, and you're allowing patterns of use to emerge. And when patterns stabilize, then you codify them further. You don't start off by assuming you can define the whole system in advance. And I give that as an example of trying to get this definition phase more correct. The fundamental scaffold in there is the medical records, and the interactions are predefined. So you've got a system which is sustainable resilience at very low cost. And effectively, the whole system then becomes a probe as to what is sustainable downstream and what can be changed. Yeah. So I say, I'm giving that as an illustration. I say what we're putting together at the moment is what will be a membership project, which will be open to companies or governments to join. So they'll chuck some money in a pool, and then we'll manage a co-development over a couple of years of the methods and tools associated with that, and the people who join it will get first and free use. Other people, obviously will pay for it, and that's going to be a partnership. I think with Excelos, we're quite close to reaching that agreement at the moment. Yeah, so I just put 2 people on the latest Prince 2 course to get involved in that. So one of the sort of points I want to leave with, and then I'm trying to leave about half an hour for questioning, is it's not that everything is complex or everything is ordered, it's that everything is a mishmash of all of those things. And this phrase I used earlier is key. You need to realize most of the world is context specific, but most of the management techniques we developed assume context independence. So they assume that things are context free. And we've seen that with business process re-engineering, Six Sigma, learning organization, Blue Ocean strategy, PIMS. I could just go around the list. I've lived through them all in my life. Yeah. The reality is different tools work in different contexts. So the function of the Cynefin framework is to first of all sort out what fits where, and then choose the appropriate tools and techniques. And in the complex world, that's where we move into this Gemba concept of continuous real-time scanning over multiple human agents, so that you're getting data in from which you can get feedback. And you can also, by the way, punch queries out to that network in real time and get the results back. The one thing, and I'll be slightly cynical here, is I've written enough monthly project reviews in my life to know that you can't trust a project manager writing a project review, because to be quite honest, they will hide failure for as long as possible to try and fix it. Whereas actually what you want in senior management is indication that failure is plausible, not even that it's happened. And that's kind of like the upfront side. Okay, so I've tried to give you some of the science. I've tried to give you some of the tools and techniques. I've basically argued for that British phrase, horses for courses. If you're going to bet on a horse race, find out what sort of ground you're on first. Is it dry? Is it soggy? Whatever. So different tools and techniques work in different combinations. So this is a both and concept, not an either or concept. Okay, so open to questions.
So thanks a lot, Dave. Really appreciate that. In terms of project controllers, right? So there's a few people out there who do planning, risk management, cost control, all of that sort of stuff. Now, in an ordered system, that's quite straightforward. If something changes, you can go and replan and sort of anticipate the future. Now, there's some parts of a project which are complex. What's your advice to a project controller if they're in a complex emergent system?
You need multiple perspectives. So one of the things we would, for example, do, I mean, ideally, we'd have the Gemba system in place. If we haven't got that, we present the current situation on the project 2 or 3 perspectives and present it to everybody involved in the project and some third parties. And we'd ask for responses within half an hour, so there was no collusion. And that's a mathematical input. Yeah, we use high abstraction metadata. And from that, we draw a contour map, which would show dominant views, minority views, and outlier views. And that's one of the ways we measure risk. Yeah, and risk is either everybody sees the problem the same way or nobody sees the problem in the same way. They're 2 different types of risk. So there are ways to make this mathematical. And to be brutal about this, I've always taken a quantitative approach. Yeah, my background is in physics, and from the point of view of anybody in theoretical physics, no social scientist has ever had enough data to form any valid conclusion. Yeah, and qualitative research and qualitative project reports are 2 subject to influence. So what I want is hard data, but to understand complexity, I need hard data from multiple human agents from multiple perspectives, and I need it in real time.
Yeah,
So
cool.
the good news is there's lots of things you can do. The bad news is they're not conventional.
Yeah, cool. In terms of data as well, I think there's ways of training up algorithms. So if somebody is frigging the data, manipulating the data, then you can start to pick that up because you can train the data sets to start to get some lead indicators in that.
And one of the big developments we did when I was working for DARPA is and one of the reasons we created the sort of narrative-based approach with high abstraction metadata is to create better training data sets for AI. The trouble is, if you train AI on raw data, it's less accurate than if you train AI on human interpreted data. So that's a focus for our work.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Tobin, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come off mute?
Yeah, I have 3 questions, which is condensed. I have way more questions, but I don't want to take away time from anyone else. First of all, I was interested in your background in philosophy and physics because I come from maths and physics. And I was wondering if you could recommend a way to get into Derrida, because the existentialist stuff, it never really clicked with me. I wrote my dissertation on Boolean logic. I was always much more in the sort of hard science camp.
Yeah, you need to understand that my father was a veterinary surgeon in rural Wales.
Okay, yeah, well, I've seen the Cymru posters.
Okay, so if at the age of 13 or 14 you have to do sheath washings on a massive bloody Hereford bull in the freezing cold, being laughed at by Welsh farmers, you decide that theoretical physics and philosophy is the future for you, all right?
Fair enough.
That's how I got into it. I think, and my first essay, I remember writing it, and this was an Anglo-Saxon philosophy day, and it came back with, "This is metaphysics, please rewrite it," and I sent it back with, "Metaphysics is philosophy, please mark it." And when I suggested a course on Sartre, the professor told me if I wanted to understand European literature, there was another department for that. So that tells you the environment, right? I actually think, I wouldn't read, we use a lot from Deleuze and Derrida and Heidegger, but we use it in translation. We don't use the original. Yeah.
Okay, so
if you really want to understand Deleuzian stuff, and assemblages, affordances, and agency are absolutely key for project management. I didn't have time to go into that. Manuel Delander's work on reinterpreting Deleuze is really important for understanding human systems. Yeah.
Okay, so Deleuze is a new name for me. I'm looking forward to reading into it.
So the Delander is very good, all right? But you need philosophy trains you to think about problems. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, the second question is, where's the wiki? Could you provide a chat so I can help? And how else can I get involved? I'm really, really interested in what you're doing.
I put the wiki up in the chat a few minutes ago. It's kinevin.io. Yeah.
Thank you.
So get involved in that. And as I say, we are going to announce this big project management program shortly. Yeah. So a collaborative development of new tools and techniques.
I'll keep an eye out. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Tobin. I've got another question for you, Dave, and then I'll pass back again. So a question about risk management, right? So risk management is a form of turbulence in a project, right? So if we can start to anticipate, we can start to do something with it. We put management actions in place, etc. It's not just risk management that creates turbulence. So from a data perspective, you've got change. So project change, it might be undesirable change because the outside environment's changed, or your client might have changed their mind and a change request comes in. From a data perspective, it's all about turbulence. All right. So have you got any thoughts about the way that we need to manage this in the future?
Part of that's the weak signal detection, right? Yeah. So turbulence isn't necessarily a problem if you can keep the flow going. The problem is whether turbulence prevents flow. And what you really want to know is that there's a sort of calcium deposit on the inside of the pipe, which is starting to form, which if you don't do something about it will make things really bad, right? Yeah. And there's some interesting metaphors for there. So if you look at some of the work I did in Thames Water, right, we borrowed a technique from the oil and gas industry, which is plastic platelets, which you put into a pipe and they found leaks and plugged it. Yeah. Now there are equivalents of those on a project management system, right? The point is the earlier you spot the things which could trigger the change, the lower the cost of changing them. Yeah. There's also this big difference between resilience and robustness. And just to be clear on this for any fans of the Talib, all right, as far as I'm concerned, anti-fragile systems are a part of resilience. They're not separate from it, and they're actually quite dangerous. Yeah. So a resilient system for me, and 90% of the known world who doesn't want to be a Talib fan, is a system which survives with continuity of identity over time. So think of a salt marsh, whereas a robust system is something which survives unchanged. Now, part of where we're going with scaffolding and objects and constraints and constructor theory, which is not the same thing as constructional law, is to actually say the architecture of a project has to change so that the project itself can mutate during its development rather than being predefined. And that's what resilience is about. And one of the measures of risk is the degree of the assumption of robustness when the system needs to be resilient. Because to go back to my metaphor, if a seawall breaks, it's catastrophic. If a salt marsh fills up, it's not catastrophic.
Cool. Great. Thank you. So we've got somebody in from New Orleans today. So we've got Greg. Greg, you've got a question. You had your sort of hand up before. You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Go for it, Greg.
Yeah,
Welcome.
thank you. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I'm coming from more of a project manager standpoint with an architecture and working with some engineering and developers here. And as many of you may know, we're just in the midst of trying to recover from Hurricane Ida. And what we're hearing is that the electrical grid in the lower parishes that got hit the hardest are not repairable. They need to be completely rebuilt. So I'm wondering if you have any comments and this resilience and robustness. I just love that, and the dynamic architecture. So this is just one example of ongoing climate change adaptation issues in the region. How do we use data to move forward, building the next generation system, rather than rebuilding a 20th century system that will be destroyed with the inevitable next even bigger storm?
Yeah, that's, I would say it was a good question, but I said that once to an Australian board and they told me not to rate their question, but to answer it. So I share that with you, all right? They called me a pommy bastard as well. I think there's, I mean, it's quite interesting because if you look at what happened with the first levees break in New Orleans, it was because the risk was assessed on a Gaussian distribution, whereas actually flooding follows a Pareto distribution. So the risk was much higher than people thought. I think the key thing on resilience is distributed systems. So I'll give you two examples on this, all right? I'm not going to address the problem directly. I'm going to give you some examples which make the point. We've been working with Australian Meals on Wheels for years. And Australian Meals on Wheels, which takes food to old people's homes, had multiple small kitchens in rural centres. And the government replaced them with something huge and centralised, which is extremely efficient. And then COVID came and the centre broke down and nobody could get meals anymore. Whereas a distributed system from the original group actually had redundancy built into it. So the first principle is you need distributed systems with multiple sources and redundancy in it. So that's kind of like one principle. And that includes creating autonomy within systems. So it's quite interesting. I was in computers in the days of mainframes. And they were good because we charged clients for machine units used. So if you were a bad programmer, you could increase the profitability of the company. But we had generators and a battery backup facility, which was twice the size of the office block. Yeah, because we had 4 minutes to close things down. So that sort of factor is key. Right? And that sort of concept of distributed system is key. The other thing is if you look at floods within the UK, so people build houses on floodplains, which is kind of like, they look pretty. They're called water meadows in the realtors literature. And kind of like the reason they're called water meadows, guys, is because often they flood. Now, if you look at medieval houses built in the area, they have no plaster on the ground floor. It's all stone. They have no damp-proof course. It's stone flags on sand. And there are hooks in the ceiling beams. So if your house floods, there's no plaster to be damaged. The water will drain away through the flags and you haul your furniture up on ropes and hang it from the ceiling beam so nothing gets damaged. End of the flood, wash the thing out, drop things down. So an architecture for that would have power, for example, come in at the top of the building, not at the bottom of the building, and the same sort of principles. So it's designing systems not to prevent failure, but on the assumption that continuous failure is quite likely. And it's interesting, I did a big project with Ard, who's in Copenhagen, where we actually captured architectural students interpreting architectural styles and processes from literature. And we had stories from people about how they wanted to live. We mashed the databases to come together to come up with new ideas for architectural styles, for new styles of living within the modern world. So that ability to take those ideas and work. So those would be two examples, and I think those are the design principles. Oh, and the other thing you could possibly do is try and persuade people in North Florida that climate change is real. In South Florida, they realize it because they're about to drown, but North Florida really needs some education.
Yeah, that's a bigger problem. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Ian, you still there, Ian? Would you like to come off mute? You got a question?
Yes, I'm Martin. Hi, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yep, good. Dave, Martin's mentioned project controls, and much of today's conventional project controls methods are all around meeting a fixed commitment, and variance from your fixed commitment is a bad thing, plus or minus. And also maybe work into extrapolating from the past as a way of predicting the future. In sort of emergent, complex, adaptive, human-based systems, like much of projects, as you say, many parts of our project are subject to that. Are those approaches of meeting commitments, for example, more or less likely to help the project?
No, they're a disaster, because people will, and I mean, people aren't stupid if they're rewarded for achieving goals. They achieve them, right? I mean, don't get me into goal achievement. So a couple of things, all right? First of all, I can give you the reference on this if anybody wants it later. Whenever people are, this is a meta study of all studies of human motivation, New Scientist, yeah? So that's a reputable source. Where people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
So if you don't need intrinsic motivation, have outcome-based targets. If you do, they're a disaster. It doesn't mean you don't have targets. We talk about vector targets. Vector targets measure, are we going in the right direction at the right speed with the right amount of resources? And they're empirically measurable, and we can get that from observations. Yeah. So the issue is not to abandon measurement, but get the right measurements for the right space. In a complex system, if you do constraint mapping, which you can find out how to do in the wiki, constraints are predictable and manageable and controllable and forecastable. So there are things in a complex system that you can monitor in a conventional way, right? And that real-time assessment is also key. So there's a lot of things we can do there, right? The key thing is, I mean, some people in complexity theory are trying to make complexity a fad. It really pisses the hell out of me. They want everything to be complex. The reality is about 80% of what we do on projects is ordered. So conventional project management works fine. It's like the whole agile community throwing out waterfall, which is just nonsensical for infrastructure projects. Yeah. So we need to get into this context-specific use of different tools and methods, and stop this context universality which people adopt.
I think that's spot on, Dave. Big round of applause for that. I think that's brilliant. So is that okay, Ian? Anything you want to come back on?
Yeah, no, that's great. I don't know whether you see a similarity, Dave, but there seems a lot of similarity in what you've been saying about real-time data of the actual project and the ability to analyze that being much more useful than good data on past projects. That seems very similar to some of the outcomes of the early systems dynamics and the work of people like Ken Cooper in the rework cycle, where their conclusion was the sooner you identify what's happening, the better. And if there's a big lag, that lag makes things worse.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I knew that stuff, and I was involved with Frank Land and the like in the 80s, right? The problem they missed out was human metadata.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem is, I mean, anything explicit will be gained. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's
Goodhart's law, isn't it?
Sorry?
Was it Goodhart's law?
Yeah, Goodhart's law is the minute a measure any statistical instrument used for policy loses all value. Stratton's variation of that is the minute a measure the target, it ceases to be a measure. The reality is nobody survives as a major project management without learning to give executives what they want to hear for as long as possible. Yeah. And trying to pretend you can stop that is just stupid, right? Because if they couldn't do that, they wouldn't be good project managers anyway. Good project managers are manipulative bastards, and they don't survive unless they are, right? So what you need is a different type of measure. The key thing we broke through, and this was broken, is high abstraction human metadata. We actually use semiotics now as well as text, so that nobody knows what the right answer is when they interpret the data, but you can look at mathematical patterns in multiple small reports, and that's the key aspect of this.
So if we could just take that one step further, if we can. So in terms of challenging some of Ian's hypotheses about past data is not necessarily useful for future projects, right? At a functional level, so if we think about functions like, for instance, a procurement, from project to project to project, there's a lot of patterns in data for procurement that can start to help you in the future. So I think it's back to your point, Dave, and I picked this up years ago from you, is the predisposition of certain work breakdown structure components, certain functions, certain engineering challenges, the predisposition of those to variance. If we can understand that and get better at it, then we can manage it appropriately. We can understand which part of the spectrum it's in, if it's going to be sort of predisposed to being a complex adaptive system, or it's going to be very ordered. So we can then start to deploy the right methods so we can start to manage it. And the project controls guys can then reach into this data set of all the cost sort of distributions against work breakdown structures that's gone before, etc.
I think there's more than that. So, for example, one of the big things we do is we measure attitudes.
Yeah.
So attitudes are a lead indicator, compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, for example, the stuff we're doing in deploying on lessons learned in the NHS, if anybody's interested in, that's a big project. Yeah. What matters to people is the ability to access more stories from people like them. So they want peer-to-peer knowledge flow without mediation. Yeah, and also they want micro observations in the field under fire, because that's where the value comes from. They don't want stuff interpreted in after action reviews. So we talk about lessons learning, not lessons learned. Yeah. The other interesting is fiction can be more powerful than fact in that respect. So I think the thing which a lot of data analytics miss is it misses that human interpretation in the core aspect of what's going on. And that has to be a high abstraction. It can't be direct. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we can do that through sort of narration of some of that variance. And if we can do that, we start to understand its context, and we start to understand.
You and I have some disagreements on this. I think you, and I think there's an epistemic justice issue here as well. I think human beings deserve the right to interpret their own data before people like you get hold of it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's spot on. And I think you can do that at source. And I think there's ways of doing it. You can do it in a graph as well. So
yeah,
cool.
You won't do it in a graph database. You need the human metadata. I mean, graph databases are very powerful, but they don't do this stuff.
Right. Okay. Right. So it sounds like potentially a bit of a product debate, but Torben, go for it.
Sorry to like weigh in on the philosophy going on here, but I was wondering. So you're not a functionalist, I take it, Dave?
No, realist and a materialist.
Yeah. So you don't believe that the workings of a human mind can be replicated by
I think that's
a computed system.
I mean, I think if you believe in the singularity, then your brain is ossified to the point where it may be possible for you. I mean, the reality.
Good answer.
We now know, and this is scientific. It's not just philosophy, that consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, and its social interactions. It's not co-located with the brain. Right.
Fascinating.
As consciousness goes, but consciousness is far more complex. Yeah.
I've always thought that consciousness extended. This is way off topic. Extended right down to your fingertips and every element which was a sensory
it's more
percept.
than that, because we now know that culture inherits within a single generation. So that's called epigenetics. It's through RNA.
Yeah.
So if you grow up in a family which actually has a high level of literacy and talks a lot, that is inherited by children.
Switches on and off genes.
Yeah, and you see that in companies. Yeah. So you can see epigenetic effects in companies as well. So it's a damn sight more complex. And I mean, there's an old phrase, all right? I mean, I'm going back to Star Trek, is, look at the Horta exit. Yeah, 2 episodes in Star Trek. Yeah, Horta in, Demon in the Dark in the first series. Yeah, which is brilliant, all right, where Spock tries to mind meld with a carbon-based intelligence, which is a good metaphor for computers. They're carbon, they're silicon, not carbon.
This is the next generation, I presume.
No, that's in the first series, yeah.
I've only started from the next generation.
Next generation,
so this is lost to me.
look at Darmonk, which is a society which speaks entirely in metaphors, and that's brilliant. And human beings use metaphors, and metaphors can't be interpreted by computers.
We'll move on from the Trekkies.
Right, sorry, I really sidetracked that. I will check this out, Dave. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you. Janssen, is that the pronunciation of it? I'm not sure if I got that right. Janssens, are you out there?
Yes, hello, nice to meet you. I'm from Belgium. So I'm a former project manager, also coaching in project management, but also deeply interested in risk management and in system thinking. Dave, thanks for all those highlights. I have two questions. First is you several times you discussed about probes. I was wondering whether there are some limitation in some probes. I guess you cannot make so much probes as you are not able to manage it. We are human being with our limits. We have the Miller theory with the Magic 7 and such things. So is there some I know it's a bit confusing using practices.
Yeah.
I don't know how it will be. Maybe my French native that is using practice in the good in the bad context. But yes, something about some insights, some feedbacks about that. And then also a second question I have to you, Dave, is regarding there are some frameworks, some good practices, best practice. You refer to Prince 2, you refer to PMI and so on. I thought that it was in some kind of periods in the end of 90s that there were a lot of models, it was really trendy about having such kind of models. But in the meantime, there are some evolution. There's the Canadian model and so on. So I was wondering if you would provide some tips to those organisms about.
So firstly, on the probes, all right, Miller's number is much misquoted. It's actually it's a time-based limitation approximated to 7 plus or minus 2 of short-term memory to long-term memory transfer. So it's not a limit on how many things we can run. It's a limit on how many things we can hold in our short-term memory. And humans have devised all sorts of ways to overcome that limitation. Yeah. So you can run probes on any coherent hypothesis. The key restriction is the probes must be safe to fail. Yeah, so you can abandon them. And what's interesting is it's a conflict resolution device. I can agree that your idea is coherent, even if I think you're wrong. Yeah. So, for example, Martin's idea on graph databases are coherent but fundamentally flawed. But it means he can run an experiment on it because I don't have to agree he's right. I just have to agree it's coherent. Yeah. So that is a major risk reduction factor in project definition, is running parallel probes. The general issue, and I don't know what's happened to PMI and Peapod these days. They're in a really bad place. You know, one of their recent acquisitions was a disaster in terms of their agile presence. Yeah. And they don't seem to be able to think differently. Excelos with Prince 2 seem much more open. They actually published Cynefin in an agile handbook for Prince 2, which is how they came across me, all right? And I do work with them. So the concept there is, and Cynefin has this, best practices are perfectly valid if you've got a high level of constraints. So it's good practice, although it's different. In a complex domain, you're seeking exaptive practice, which is in the EU handbook designed as radical repurposing. So it's very quickly reusing existing capability for novel use. And that actually is a key project management skill which isn't taught. But good project managers do it intuitively. So again, the whole point about Cynefin, which is a framework, not a model, yeah, and that's an important distinction. So is to legitimize traditional project management and create the space for something new. The other thing I'll say is that systems thinking is not the same thing as complexity thinking. They're completely different. Yeah, and complexity thinking is a whole different scientific approach to the world. It has very little in common with systems thinking.
Could you explain why for those people who's not sort of up to speed with it, Dave? And we
Well,
want to go
first of all, most people, when they think of systems thinking, think of systems dynamics because it was popularized by Senge from Forrester, and Forrester himself said Senge didn't understand it. You then got the whole cybernetics crew who was stuck with Beer. You've got the soft systems guys around Checkland, who I drew on extensively. So you've got different schools of systems thinking. But generally, they're about it's a social construct as a theory. It's not a scientific approach, whereas complexity comes from biology and physics and chemistry. So it's got hard science behind it. And they define a system as a closed system, whereas complexity says systems are open. And their general method, if you look at it, I'm writing a blog post on this at the moment. I thought it was about time to attack Senge, so I may get it out this week. Which basically, their whole approach is to say, this is bad, we should do this. So they try and focus on individual behavior as the mechanism for change. And they've had 30 years and it hasn't worked, so it's time to move on, right? We focus on building processes by which people's individual behavior doesn't matter so much, which is actually how military work, yeah? And we draw a lot from that.
Cool. Great. I think we're out of time, Dave, pretty much. Yeah. You've got your next session in 4 minutes by the sound of it. So a massive thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, 4 minutes to go in.
Thank you very much.
So a big round of applause to Dave. Thank you very much. Cheers, Dave. Really appreciate it. And we'll catch up soon. Thank you.